Hello and welcome you all to this Democracy Dialogue series organized by New Socialist Initiative. We are with us this evening, Professor Rajeev Bhargava. Uh, we are happy and we're honored that he accepted our invite to deliver the 29th lecture in this series. Uh, Professor Rajeev Bhargava is an honorary fellow at the CSDS right now and director of the Parekh Institute of Political Thought. He has taught at Delhi University, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and various international universities. And his main work, he internationally acclaimed for his work on individualism and secularism. Some of his books, I would like to share information about his books. Individualism in Social Science, What is Political Theory and Why Do We Need It? The Promise of India's Secular Democracy. He has few edited books to his contribution. He has contributed to few edited books also. Secularism, its critiques, politics and ethics of the Indian Constitution. And his recent books, edited version is Bridging Two Worlds, Comparing Political Thought and Statecraft in India and China. Apart from his writings, so scholarly and academic writings, his column in the Hindu is widely appreciated. And it was last year only, his collection of his essays was published by the title Hope and Despair, 100 Ethical Reflections on Contemporary India. This evening, Professor Bhargava will be enlightening us about democracy and religion in modern India, some critical and self-critical reflections. Welcome, Professor Rajeev Bhargava, for this Democracy Dialogue series.
Thank you, Subhash, and thank you, Ravi, for inviting me. I'll begin straight away. I'm a little disorganized, so forgive me in advance for I don't have a prepared lecture, and I may move in fits and starts as I go along. So, yeah, the subtitle, Critical and Self-Critical Reflections, is extremely important here. Democracy and Modern Religion in India, if we were to take just this title, which we have together chosen, I think some of what I have to say today may seem quite unrelated to this title. But then I would argue that there are two ways of interpreting the title. One is a little flat. I'm not saying that this is illegitimate, but it is a bit flat, it's horizontal, and it's synchronic. The other is to look at it more dynamically, vertically and diachronically. So it will give an idea of how we have reached where we have reached. And in fact, I want to say that this is not the diachronic frame that I'm taking, or you might even call it the historical frame, although this is not how professional historians would look at it. It's more a speculative view. It's a kind of a philosopher's view. The diachronic frame is not short term, it's not even medium term, it's really very long term. And it pertains to our idea of religion. And that's exactly what I mentioned in the abstract, that, our whole focus since the mid-80s, if not earlier, certainly since the mid-80s, we've been focusing on secular being an alien concept. But it's very interesting that nobody has thought of a very convincing view that religion is an alien concept in India. The idea of religion is not part of, the multiple traditions that we associate with the subcontinent. And that is exactly the point that I'm going to make, that the idea of religion itself is something which is at least, if we leave aside one particular strand of the ancient tradition of the subcontinent, namely the Vedic Brahmanism or Dharamshastric Brahminical tradition, which probably worked with a certain idea of religion, which is very close to the Western, modern Western conception of religion. And perhaps some strands of Islamic traditions, particularly I'm reminded of certain Naqshbandi orders of Sirhandi and others. If you leave them aside, I don't think we've had a conception of religion proper. And if it was there, as I said, it was marginal. So when the modern idea of religion came to India, what kind of havoc did it play, and how it unsettled the imaginary, the social and pluralist imaginary of India? And what impact does it have? What relationship does this idea of religion have with democracy? That is what I want to discuss. So this is a speculative history. It's an ideational history. It's a sketch. It's just a beginning. But I think the reason why I want to, I dare to put these points across is because of the political urgency of putting these matters in the public domain. If many people here are not convinced that that the idea of religion is an alien idea, then I'm very happy to concede that we had one conception of religion, and that conception of religion was completely had to deal with a new idea of religion that came with colonial modernity. And at least these two different senses of religion coexist in India. And the term religion, the word religion, is used for both these. And if secularism is something to do with religion, and I'll talk about this in greater detail, Western secularism is something that we cannot understand unless we relate it to religion. Indian conception of religion also cannot be understood unless we relate it to religion, but here religion doesn't mean just one thing, it means two things. And we've got to understand that ambiguity of the term religion and the explosive potential that the second understanding of religion, which I associated with the modern West, something that really emerged in 16th, 17th century during the wars of religion. What that has done when it came to India, what it did to India is something which I'm really quite interested in. And I believe that it's fundamentally undemocratic. It's anti-democratic. This idea of religion cannot be consistent with democracy. And in the West, people have had to, the emergence of democracy, and we know that democracy itself is fragile, even in the West. But to whatever extent the emergence of democracy in the West has happened with the decline of that Western idea of religion, because the two don't really sit very well. And to the extent that this Western, I'm using it as very loosely. I don't want to be too crude and in using this Western, non-Western dichotomy. But nonetheless, there are interesting differences between the way certain ideas developed in other traditions, and particularly how they were interpreted in the Western modern, early Western modern idea. I think early Western modern period. I think that tradition is certainly not compatible with democracy, and what we are witnessing today is precisely that. Okay, that's one thing I want to mention. The other thing I could mention now or sometime in the middle of the lecture, but I know that as I talk about, as I elaborate the lecture, I probably forget. So I might as well make this point before I get into the meat of the lecture. And that is that I believe that ideas grow in a certain ideological milieu, in a certain ideological context, in a certain within a certain ethos, in response to them. But I don't believe in the strong sociology of ideas, or sociology of knowledge. I don't think these ideas are permanently fixed. Some of these ideas are good, some are not all that great, but I don't believe that those the traditions or the milieu in which these ideas were born, even when these ideas are not all that worthwhile, and many ideas we know are unworthy, morally unworthy, and many of them are in fact not the one that I'm going to discuss right now, but we know that many ideas are in fact close to being evil. I don't think that the context and those traditions in which these ideas are born are permanently tainted by them. And I say that because the idea of religion, for many scholars, was born in ancient Egypt. I mean, pre-Islamic Egypt, with uh, uh, a person, a ruler called Akhenaten. It got into the Jewish tradition, the Christian tradition, the Islamic tradition, the Abrahamic traditions, but the fact that it's born in that tradition doesn't make those traditions permanently tainted. That's the point that I wanted to make. I don't mean to denigrate those traditions. There are many valuable things in those, valuable kind of elements in those traditions. And even when this idea was born in those traditions, it doesn't mean that now we have to, part our ways with that tradition as a whole. We just have to realize that ideas do get born somewhere, and then they travel, and they get changed, and they get used in the same malevolent way in other traditions. And or they change the new traditions into which they have traveled. So I don't want to sort of labor this point, but we can discuss it later. All I wanted to say is that even when I say that this is something which was born, say, in Egypt, or in the linked to the Abrahamic traditions, I don't mean to denigrate the entire tradition, but I do want to say that this is a dangerous idea, and when as it travels to other parts of the world, and as it mingles with those traditions themselves become somewhat dangerous. Okay. So let me. I promised that I'll do some speculative history of what we call religion, a long-term history of religion. So let me begin with a thought experiment, and I go way back when there was only one world, and there was only one life and one death. That is to say, there was no idea of rebirth, there was no idea of re-death. And of course, people in those social milieus, they also had a certain conception of what they consider to be a good life, what was valuable. And the world that I'm talking about, which was, what we today would call a secular world. It was this worldly, one life, one death. These people in that world were pursuing certain goods, and the goods that they were after. Remember, this is some kind of a thought experiment, although I have certain social contexts and certain social worlds in mind, and I'll refer to them. They were after, the elites, certainly, they were after more wealth, they were after more treasure, more territory, more horses, more cattle, more life, meaning longer life, and a life without disease, a healthy life, a life that extended to the proverbial 100 years. So let's imagine that people were, quite at home. They were oriented to the world. They were at home in this world, and they were in pursuit of what we might call this worldly goods. And they had a certain strategy of achieving it. And in these olden times, these ancient times, one of the strategies that they have was ritual and magic. So a lot of them felt that if you performed ritual sacrifice, that is to say, if you had something valuable which you sacrificed to fire, you will get more of the same. And there were these rituals had to be performed in a certain way. If you perform them well and meticulously, with the recitation of certain hymns, through these mimetic acts and through by the accompaniment of certain recitations, you would be able to achieve the ends that you were desiring. That is, all these worldly goods. Many of these people, although this was not necessary and this was not certainly not absolutely vital, but many of these people also believed in gods and goddesses. These gods and goddesses sort of permeated the world. They went in and out of the world. They were part of the cosmos. And a lot of them believed that if you sacrificed something valuable in fire, then the aroma that emerges from the fire and the smoke that emerges, that is consumed by the gods. So the malevolent gods are appeased and the benevolent gods work in your favor. So you have these gods which are propitiated, and it's only by the propitiation of these gods that you will be able to secure this worldly goods. Now, which is the world that I have in mind here? I have in mind I'm obviously interested. This is something which I believe was in large parts of the world. I mean, before the ancient Jewish world was pretty much like that. A whole lot of other Adivasi worlds, I don't know, but certainly many but the world that I have in mind is the world of the Rig Veda, the early Rig Veda, which is exactly very similar to what I'm describing. Now, how is all this upset? Not just in the subcontinent, but also probably in other parts of the world where ritual sacrifice is very important. I think the development of the capacity of what we might call transcendence. And I don't want to get into this debate about strong and weak transcendence. Just basically what I mean by transcendence, the ability to step back and to look beyond. Stepping back means that you can actually now look at your world, the whole world, and you can also look at yourself more holistically and more comprehensively. And by doing so, you can identify the strengths and weaknesses, and particularly the weaknesses, both in the world in which you're living and in yourself. So you'd start developing an idea of a better life, a qualitatively better life, not more of the same that you were trying to secure in the past, but something qualitatively different, a new world, a new person, a new man or new man in the generic sense. So you begin to see that a gap is opened up between the world and yourself as it currently exists, and the world and yourself as they would be at their best. And that gap opens up, and now you have to look for a new strategy of bridging the gap to realize this new world, which is not available to your senses right now. That strategy is really, I mean, it's an intellectual leap here involved, a change in your I mean, transcendence itself is an intellectual capacity of a new kind, but to have this vision and to realize that there is something radically new that you have to do in order to move from what you are today and what you can be in future. This vision itself is what you are really striving for. And let's say that there are some people who are better equipped than you are when you're living this in this period, better equipped than you are to articulate that vision and to chalk out a path by which to realize those visions. So you have a teacher who you start following, a guru, and you realize that you're not the only one, because this is something which is happening more, socially. It's widespread. So there are other people who are also either looking for alternate paths or joining you in the same path, becoming your fellow travelers. And so this is what we might call an ethics of self-fulfillment or ethics of ultimate self-fulfillment, an activity, an endeavor which involves going deep and digging deeper and going higher, and an activity that cannot be done without a teacher and without fellow travelers. Now, as I said, this can be done with new sets of rituals. It can be done by building a new narrative, a new myth, or through the use of reason. And at a certain point of time, I mean, I'm now talking about a millennia or so within which these things happen throughout the world. It starts, I'm getting a little historical here. I'm daring to be, but say 6th century before the Common Era until the 3rd century after the Common Era, about 8-9 centuries. In different parts of the world, you have these great intellectual changes taking place. But in India, you have, very interestingly, many ethics of self-fulfillment that continue to depend on gods and goddesses. There are some ethics that begin to depend on one god, and there are other ethics that are entirely independent of God or gods and goddesses. So you might say they're completely atheistic. And I mean, this is pretty well known. I'm sure people who are good historians of ancient India know this pretty well, that Buddhism, Jainism are all what we today would call atheistic. They're not dependent on any god. In fact, many of the ancient Indian philosophies, such as Mimamsa, which is the hermeneutic interpretative method of understanding the Vedic rituals, even they don't believe in God. And if I've been speaking to some of the scholars of this period, early BC and after the Common Era, in that the 500, 600 years around the turn of the millennia, ancient India had predominantly atheistic philosophies. They were not dependent on gods and goddesses, and certainly not dependent on an idea of a single god. So that they were not monotheistic. Okay, so we had this kind of pluralism. It's an this is certainly, hardly, I wouldn't like to call it Hindu, unless you want to use it in a geographical sense. This is certainly a land which is beyond the Sindhu. Let's call it Sindhu. Let's call it Sindhu worldview, which is as I said, very pluralist, and deeply pluralist in the sense that it has place for gods and goddesses, place for one god, and place for no god. But there is also something else. There is a great deal of fluidity. There are no categorical identities. There are no sharply demarcated communities. There is no exclusive allegiance. There are multiple allegiances. There is a lot of fluidity. And there are lots of very interesting reasons. I can't go into them. I'm not a historian, but I will still allude to one or two of them. But let's say this is one. This is one kind of, you can call it. There's no need to even. I call it religio-philosophical perspectives, because as I said, it's myth and narrative dependent, but it's also reason dependent. I mean, Buddhism is not. What is it? Religion, philosophy? Jainism, is it a philosophy or a religion? I mean, when does it become religion? It's not very clear. Both religion and philosophy are terms which are not used by the people who are articulators of their own ideas or of the teachings of the Buddha or Mahavira. None of them are using these terms. We have other terms. So let's just say there are multiple plural religio-philosophical perspectives. And when a lot of people say that India is a land of religions and multiple religions, plural religions, I mean, I would grant that there is this great deal of fluidity and plurality in the ancient Indian or Sindhu religio-philosophical perspectives. Having said that, I would say that this is also true, perhaps, of the whole of Asia. It's not just an Indian, this is not Indian exceptionalism. I think this is true of China. This is true of the whole of Southeast Asia. It's true of Japan. It's a human condition. It's not something which is uniquely Indian. But since we have to, I mean, I'm more interested in India. I would say with a good deal of confidence that this is certainly true of India. And we can say that, I mean, if people want to use the term religion for this, then, yeah, we had multiple plural religions. But now let's say, to continue with this thought experiment, we have a second step, which is taken throughout the first millennia, and you find it even in early second millennia. And that is the teachings are systematized, they're made more coherent, and you have the formation of intellectual doctrines, both philosophical and religious, or religio-philosophical doctrines. And people start to identify with these doctrines. They are attached to these doctrines. And so you might say anachronistically that they have a certain sense of self, a certain kind of identity, which is defined in terms of these doctrines. And with that, these loose communities become a little more rigid. And that is, again, something that happens. And as they become more rigid, they become a little more distinguished from one another. The boundaries become a little more hardened. You have what, you can say that, I mean, although the term sect is got a very specific connotation. But let's say they are kind of, loosely sectarian divisions develop, and there is a disputation, there is contestation, and there are skirmishes between people, there is competition. So that is all something which is granted, and I grant that this is happening in India in the past, and this is the second step towards, or the first step towards, what we might call religionization proper. But now we have a third step, which is what I called, which is something which I'm very unhappy with, and which is a dangerous step, and which is the introduction into this ethical doctrine, into their respective ethical doctrines, of an emphatic conception of truth. And as I said, I associate, I mean, this is something I've leaned on the work of an Egyptologist called Jan Assmann, who unfortunately died recently, who uses this term, emphatic conception of truth. So in their ethics, an emphatic conception of truth is injected, which means that there is now a very radical separation between a true God and false gods. Now, false gods are in plural, but true God is in singular. And it's not denied that these false gods exist, but precisely because these gods exist and they are false, you are forbidden to worship them. That has to be an injunction. So you have to worship only one true God and not all other gods. And you have to adhere to only one doctrine and not to other doctrines. You have to deny them. They are false doctrines. You're not supposed to follow them. And with this, you are, I mean, the idea of other, as I said, is there in a sectarian milieu, which is there in India. It is there even when there are differences where communities exist, but those communities have some boundaries, but these boundaries are porous and fluid, but the other is there. But now you have a radical othering, and not only a radical othering, but the other who is an enemy to be fought. Well, not just to be fought. The first attempt is to bring him to your own camp, convert him, if you please. But if that doesn't succeed, you're free to eliminate the enemy. You can expel the enemy, because that person who is holding that false doctrine and who's a worshipper of a false god is an existential threat. You cannot live with that person. And this is as I said, it's a very dangerous idea. It's fundamentally anti-pluralist. It cannot be home to pluralism. And not only that, another thing comes in, because even within your own community, which is a very rigid community now. There's already, a dogma, and you have a rigid demarcated community. In your community, if there is somebody who strays from the true path, then that person is also an enemy. He is an internal enemy. And the treatment for this internal enemy is harsher than the treatment of an external enemy. He's not just a deviant. He is more than a person who's deviated from the truth. He's again somebody who becomes an even greater threat. And you see this happening in 16th, 17th century within Christianity a lot when all the religious wars take place, and with a lot of violence. So a new kind of hatred, a new form of violence. Now, again, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not talking about the quantum of violence, right? The quantum of violence in India may be much more. And there is physical violence, there is ritual violence, there's caste-related, there's domestic violence, there's women-related violence, all of that violence. But if you have a pluralist ethos where there are fluid boundaries, a certain kind of creed or religion-related hatred is not there. And you do not have religion-related wars, and you certainly don't have extreme forms of religion-related persecutions. Not to say that there are no skirmishes, occasional violence, but violence takes place, and then suddenly things can be restored. You can get back to equilibrium even after you've killed a lot of one another. There is some, you tend to forget that something very major has happened, but that's not the case in that other way of thinking. So this is a step that is a radical step taken towards what I call religionization and towards the formation of a religion proper. Now, there is another step, fourth step, and that is certainly taken in the medieval period in the West. I'm not sure about India because I tend to, I'm not going to say very much on this. I would put forward the idea that it hasn't taken place in India without having any evidence. And this step is the following. Nobody lives by ethics alone. There are always social interactions, and then there are ideologies which are legitimizing social interactions. There are norms of social interactions. Sometimes they're implicit, very often they're explicit. What are these norms? These norms are who are you going to be with, who are you going to live with, who are you going to marry, who are you going to dine with, who are you going to work with, which work is worthwhile, which work is demeaning, what kind of status does a work have, and therefore you who are occupants of that work, what kind of status you have. These are all what I call norms of social interaction. There's always an ideology legitimizing that. And we know that in the past, there have been what we might call quasi-egalitarian movements, but by and large, a lot of the ancient periods are deeply hierarchical. So here is the idea that I have, which I'm going to put forward, that the relationship between ethics and this ideology of social interaction or norms of social interaction, the relationship can either be very weak or very loose, or it can be very tight. So tight that it forms one system, one comprehensive system, a total system, or you might even call it a totalitarian system. I'm using it very loosely here. And this is the next step towards what I might call religion proper, that religion itself becomes a total system. And here, a bureaucratic organization really helps in controlling. And so something like a church, in the sociological sense, not in the theological sense, but in sociological sense, something like a church helps in that social control and in creating a total religion. And that is, now I believe that in India, of course, there have been these multiple ethics, and we know that there are norms of social interaction, deeply hierarchical norms of social interaction, what we call the varnashrama dharma. But the varnashrama dharma is only a part of what I call dharmashastra Brahmanism. But it's not very clear to me whether it is part of it's part of all the other ethical worldviews, including what later came to be part of Hindu worldviews. So I don't think there was an attempt by a certain, in Dharmashastra Brahmins to create a total religion, but that attempt never succeeded. And it never succeeded because well, let's not go into that. The point I'm making is that this step towards the formation of total religion, that step was not taken, but it was taken in medieval Christianity, thanks to a bureaucratic organization, a social organization called the church. And finally, the fourth step, which is a very crucial step again for the formation of what I call religion proper, is that this people who adhere to this total religion, mediated by a very strong controlling social organization, these people want public power or state power to be wholly tilted towards them. In fact, they want it, I mean, ideally, they would want it to become the same, a theocracy. But if there is no theocracy, at least a very strong monopolistic privilege be given to one total religion. It is an exclusivist religion. It's one religion. Other religions don't really have a space to exist because this religion won't allow. It's so exclusive. It's so dogmatic. It's so monochromatic that doesn't really allow for other religions. And really, this begins in 1492 in Spain, when Jews and Muslims are thrown out of Catholic Spain. But it becomes a model for the formation of proto-national states in 16th, 17th century Europe with the wars of religion, when the solution to this war is the promulgation of certain the signing of certain treaties, the treaties of Augsburg, the treaties of that's the most famous one. Anyway, where the idea is that you have one law, one faith, one king, one law, one faith. So the prince or the king or the queen announces, he publicly confesses what his religion is, and that every member of the subject community in the territory also becomes a member of that religious or church. And those who are not, who don't accept that, are either expelled or exterminated, or at best they're allowed to live, but only when they're completely invisibilized from the public space. This is what toleration really means. It's privatization of the minority, non-dominant religion, right? It's absent from public sphere. So you have, if you have a area which is declared Protestant, then Catholic Church, which once used to be one church who used to be on the main high street, that church is now taken over by Protestants, and the Catholics have to find, if they are to survive at all, then they can live in a residential building, in a by-lane, not on High Street, and people, they will never become publicly acknowledged. They're private. Everybody knows that they're there, but they're never publicly acknowledged. They remain public. And that is what toleration really means in this part of Europe. Okay, so this is the fourth step. So you have a theological condition of truth and falsity. You have a sociological condition of there being a church of a total religion, and you have a political condition of a very strong relationship between church and state. And all these steps are taken in Europe. And now we can understand why Western secularism emerges, because it just cannot tolerate so it is against Christianity. Let's be clear about that. It's against Christianity, the form that Christianity has taken by the 16th, 17th century. It's first of all dogmatic and monistic, and people want, I mean, there have always been movements against it, but now you have a full-fledged movement of pluralism. And so for pluralism, against the domination by the church of other social institutions and certainly individual freedom. So you have secularization of society for the sake of the market, of course, but also individual freedoms of all kinds, which are intertwined with the birth of the market, free market and capitalism. And you have a very strong demand that there be church-state separation. And Western secularism is all about that. Pluralism, unchurching, church-state separation. And if this is what religion is, Western secularism has to be anti-religion. And I've never understood this as well as I've understood in more recent times. And if this is what religion will be anywhere in the world, then anybody who's for pluralism, who's for freedom and for equality, and who would want to control social political power, not to align political power with this dogmatic, ideological, will want a political secularism, right? So I think that if I was living in the West, I would be a Western secularist, because I wouldn't want any of these this aspect of religion. Certainly, I would go for spiritualities of all kinds. I would go, I mean, if I'm inclined to that, or I would go for other forms of religiosities, which have none of these features. I would go back to ancient Asia or India with their older religiosities. I'll try to retrieve them. But I would be against this religion. I wouldn't want any new religion around which has these features, whether it is, or any. Okay. But now, let me come to India. I've already said that I believe that for a very long time, you can say that there is, with all kinds of, regional variations and the normal zigzag of history that you should be sensitive to. It's not a linear story of, always being totally pluralist, always, but let's say until the 16th, 17th century, 18th century, I would say that there is a social ideology of caste, which is, you might call it Brahmanism, but alongside that, you have these pluralist ethics of self-fulfillment, whether they're philosophical or religious. There is Buddha, there is Jain, there is a new, Jews come in, Parsis come in, Muslims come in, Christians, Syriac Christians, and this ethics. And so the story of India being, from Weber, a modern, Weberians or Weber talking about the tolerance of Indian religion, I think there is some truth in this, that there is a certain kind of fluidity, this spirit of accommodation, what I call pluralist imaginary. I think that's true. But it's always existed with a very rigid social ideology of caste. In fact, the irony is, and the paradox is, that these two have coexisted, and one has helped the other. So if there is you can be a Brahmin in the caste structure, but instead of becoming a ritual Brahmin, Vedic Brahmin, you can become a Buddhist. So like Nagarjuna, the philosopher, is a Buddhist. I'm not saying that he converted to Buddhism. I don't know. But because he was also performing some rituals. I mean, a whole lot of the kings, they were Buddhist in their ethics, but they were also, I mean, all their political rituals were performed by the Brahmins. So in some senses, they were participants in some kind of, what we today call Hinduism. And the same happened with the Muslim elites and the Christian elites. And, they all fitted into the caste structure, and they all benefited from caste hierarchies. But they also formed, I mean, the Khojas, who began to believe that, now I'm not totally, how much time have I taken? How much time do I have? It's getting, what time is it? 6:55. So I've got 5-10 minutes. Okay, so what's happening now? 19. I think I think this is all there. But in the late 18th and early 19th century, the first step towards the second major step towards religionization takes place. But it is not exclusivism, and it's not politicization of religion. That's because of a certain form of, the presence of an imperial presence. But the first thing that happens is the formation of a total religion, and Hinduism, 19th century, which is a project in which not only the missionaries and colonial officials, but a very vast majority of upper caste Hindus take part in the formation of Hinduism. So yes, Hinduism as a proper religion is a construct of the late 18th century, and certainly all through the 19th century. And I would even venture to say, although here I'm very weak in my evidence, but I would say that what I call the social ideology of Brahmanism, which legitimates caste hierarchy, now becomes a central part of what we call Hinduism. And it stands to reason. If there's no Hinduism before the 18th century, how can the caste system, which is separate, which is, which is pervasive, which is there which is everywhere in India, regardless of whether you're a Muslim or a Christian, you're all taking part in it. How can it be part of Hinduism? It becomes part of Hinduism. But of course, there is something like, Dharma-shastric Brahmanism, which is there. It's part of the scriptures. It's sanctioned by it. And the Brahmins wanted to become part of it. Those Brahmins, not every Brahmin, but certainly Dharma-shastric Brahmins, they wanted to become part of the ideology of the whole society. They wanted to become the norms followed by whole society, but of course they don't succeed. I don't think so. Partly because they themselves are in some ways not very powerful for the whole society in what's the so-called medieval period. But let's say the first step is the formation of Hinduism. The second step is the introduction of this true-false idea, which actually comes with the making of Hinduism as a national religion. Now, remember, I said that although this distinction of true and false is born in Egypt and then taken up in the Abrahamic traditions, it's very soon, it doesn't remain restricted to it. You can even say it's secularized. And I mean, God knows what would have happened if the logical positivists of the early 20th century, if they had come to power and if they had become imperialists, what they would have done. They were a total secularists, atheists. But I mean, if they found even poetry and art totally meaningless, and only everything, unless it is verified, unless it is it passes through the verification principle. If imagine it became a social ideology, I think it would have played havoc. I mean, it's the most complete monism, which has nothing to do with religion, right? I would imagine that in certain communist societies, people who had state power certainly tried to make their socialisms into some version of this true and false thing, really entered into their ideas, their dogmas, and you don't find the toleration of ideological pluralism in these societies. Certainly, I would imagine Stalinism to be like that. I would imagine Cambodia's Pol Pot's Cambodia to be like that. I don't know what Albania was like, but I mean, this is all, just I'm throwing up things. But it's also there in ultranationalism. And I think in India, this internal plurality of Hinduism just could not be eliminated, but Hinduism could become a national religion. And here is 1925, Mr. Savarkar, his idea of Hindutva, and I don't need to elaborate on that, but idea of who is a true son of the soil and who's a false son of the soil, or not a son of the soil, or a fake son of the soil. That idea comes in 1925. So this exclusivism doesn't really come within. It's difficult because of the older internal plurality of Hinduism, but it does come through this backdoor of nationalism. So Hindu nationalism is exclusivist. Hindutva is exclusivist. But it didn't, as we know, it didn't come to power, but it's what we're witnessing today is an attempt to have this exclusive Hindu nationalism get state powers. A power of the state which works only for a certain kind of Hindus. And the same thing, the other as an enemy and internal enemies, those who do not believe in your version of Hindu, are internal enemies, they're anti-nationals. All of that is coming in now and with the state power. So steps that were taken and steps that in Europe, for example, through a certain kind of secularism, people have pushed back against them. Those are oddly and in a very pernicious way coming now, and they were not this exclusivism is fundamentally anti-democratic. This idea of religion is fundamentally undemocratic. It cannot sit very easily with democracy. And if you have this idea of religion, and certainly this idea of religion-based nationalism, I won't even call it religious nationalism because religious has other connotations as well. Religion-based nationalism in this modern sense, this cannot be, this has to come with a fundamentally anti-democratic tendency, not just tendency, but a strong current of it is not current, not something stronger I want to use, but it's fundamentally. So I think I would say that there are a lot of things which explain the birth of what the coming of Hindutva in its present, in this Hindutva, not as its present form, Hindutva. And a lot of, social factors, economic factors, many other ideological factors, all of them have to be taken into account. And I've not been able to, obviously, I'm not competent to provide that. But I would say that this speculative history of religiosities and the transformation of the religiosities into modern religion, in the sense that the taking of these 3 steps, that's something which has to be taken into account when we are explaining what's happening today. Indian secularism, and this is my last, Indian secularism, therefore, has something in common with Western secularism, but something very distinctive about it. One is that it has to, the nourishment, the continuity, the preservation, the conservation, you can use what you want, but of the pluralist imaginary, which I believe still survives in India. And it's been reproduced. Survival is like, it's been reproduced through a number of social movements. And you know all the movements in the past. And I think all of that, that is something which is we recognize. We use the word religion both for these older forms of religiosities and for new forms of religions, but we accept the plurality of these religions as well. But that is one aspect, and which makes it very different from Western secularism, which is shaped by a certain development of Christianity and the pushback against Christianity since the 18th, 19th century, and therefore, a certain kind of secular humanist ethos, particularly in Europe. So, but that in India, pluralist bit you can get without having to be, because secular humanism, which I associate with atheism, the non-God perspectives are already there, living side by side with God-based and gods and goddesses-based. And I don't think there's no way, for a variety of reasons, I don't think this plurality can be eliminated. It's neither desirable nor possible to eliminate this. I think it's something that you have to live with. Each one has to live with it. But one of the ways in which you protect this religious plurality is by countering what I call interreligious domination, which again is something which is new in India since the 19th century. And European secularism did not face it because it had eliminated diversity, and therefore the prospect of interreligious domination simply did not exist. Because these were predominantly single religion societies, not only single religion, but single church societies. Most of Northern Europe is Protestant in one way or another. Most of Southern Europe is Catholic. And there's only a small middle belt in Europe, which consists of Belgium and Netherlands and some parts of what later became Germany, which were biconfessional. But these are predominantly single religion societies. They are not societies which are pluralist. And they have only, since the Second World War, they've started because of the immigration of labor from former colonies. An unprecedented diversity has been witnessed in Europe, the like of which has never been there in pre-modern Europe. And even in modern Europe, where different kinds of Christian faiths have to coexist with pre-Christian and post-Christian faiths. And this is completely new. And therefore, they must have something to learn from not today what is happening, which is exactly what happened in Europe, but something to learn from the constitutional, from the pluralist imaginary and the extent to which that pluralist imaginary has been absorbed in the constitution of the country. But interreligious domination is not the only thing that we have to worry about. There's also what we might call intra-religious domination, which has been the focus in Europe, church, to protect the members of the church against the control of the church, to fight for emancipation of individuals, for their freedom, and for internal minorities for their freedom. I think that is something in India that has to be, the church is its caste is what we have to look for. The intra-religious domination here is caste-based, and that is why I'm very disappointed when the minorities and movements spearheaded by Christians and Muslims, break off from movements, both movements of women's emancipation and movements for the emancipation of Dalits. Empowerment and the destruction of caste structure and caste-based hierarchies. I think this has to be a broader front. I'm very surprised that I was quite surprised to find in a recent visit, and I have to end now. It's really taken a long time. We will have only 20 minutes for questions because I have another lecture at 7:30. There are groups abroad, Dalit groups abroad, which are reaching out to minorities to open a broad front. But I hope that this is happening here, but I don't see this. As a matter of fact, I find that a lot of the lower so-called lower caste groups are being inducted into the broader movement of Hindutva, and the minorities are isolated. This is something we should have worked on that much earlier. But in India, as I've been saying, secularism is not anti-religious. It has to protect religious pluralism, by which I mean philosophical pluralism. But it's against institutionalized religious domination in both their forms, inter and intra, which means protection of minority rights, but also protection of individual rights within minority groups, and fighting the communalism of both majority and minority groups, and the casteism in both majority and minority groups, and the patriarchy in both minority and majority groups. Fighting both of that and preserving religious pluralism. And that's what Indian secularism stands for. Thank you.
Thank you, Raju, for this thought-provoking presentation. I would request my senior comrade and friend Ravi to say a few words first about Raju. Ravi, please.
Thank you, Subhash, and thank you, Rajiv Saab, for accepting our invitation. And what you have said this evening, there is so much to mull over, so much to think over. And there is very little time because you have to go for another lecture. So let me just quickly ask a broad question to kick off the question and answer thing, which is, okay, so if pluralistic religiosities are replaced by religion, as you have defined in, let's say, 17th century Europe, then my curiosity is about when and how do religious identities get hardened and start playing political functions and roles. For example, do you think that there were no political dimension to conflicts between Buddhism and Sanatani Brahminical religiosity in the, let's say, what you did not use the word, but you were referring to the axial era for a few centuries before the common era and a couple of centuries after that. It seems to me, I mean, whatever little common sense history we have, is that religious identities were there and conflicts were there too. The reason I am asking is that if religious identities become part of the fault lines in the society, which can then be um, misused by malignant political forces, as it is happening in today's India, then is it only a phenomenon of when religion, in your definition, comes into existence, or were there political religious identities even in the period when pluralistic religiosities with the not so emphatic version of truths were prevalent before 17th century? So basically my question is about when did religious identities start playing a political role?
Yeah, okay. So I'll answer it as briefly as possible. To the very limited knowledge that I have about this, I'm still beginning my kind of work. If I remain around, then I hope in 10 years' time I will produce something interesting and substantial. But I would say that even in the 16th century, I mean, I will refer to two. There's a book in the 8th, 9th century of a Kashmir Shaivite called Jayant Bhatta, Agam Dambara. And there is a new work by people like Andrew, I think, what is it? Andrew, not Elaine Fisher, who is written on Hindu pluralism, but Unifying Hinduism or something like that, which is by Andrew Williamson. Now, I think which is the study of doxographies. Now, I do, as I said, I mean, the idea of religion in the sense in which we were, the pernicious idea of religion, let's call it that, exclusivist. It's not that it's not around, but I don't think it ever becomes mainstream in India. And one of the reasons for why that doesn't happen is because of the absence of the sympathetic idea of truth. Truth is more a continuum. So even the least, I mean, the most distant worldview from your own worldview, even that has some truth in it, is not completely deprived of truth. So the ideas of superiority and inferiority based on who has more and who has less truth, those are there. But the idea of exclusive possession of truth, I mean, barring a few, and you can name some, there are, I would certainly, I would admit that there are some groups around. But I would say that by and large, this more spectrum, continuum, truth as a continuum rather than truth and false as dichotomy. That is a more pervasive idea in not only in India but also, I mean, look at China, for example, where you have, even today, you have 3 ways of life, which are in Japan. Only thing is that 19th century nationalism everywhere, ethnic nationalism, which is an equally pernicious idea, that has really ruined things all over Asia, in Sri Lanka, in India, in Pakistan, now in Thailand, in all sorts of things. But by and large, if you remove that 19th century Sri Lanka, Burma, if you if you the idea of truth as a continuum is much more pervasive. And with that, the idea of the other as a radical, completely unacceptable other and as an enemy, that's also not there. So again, I would say this is just a conjecture, and I would be very happy to be corrected on this, because a lot of people keep providing evidence of, Shaivites damaging and destroying Jain temples and Buddhist temples being destroyed, and but I don't think that the justification and the ideological basis of the destruction was because these are people who we cannot live with, that these are our enemies. These are permanent enemies. They were temporary adversaries, or they were, and I would side with secular historians here, that the religious motive, religious hatred, and religious violence, which a lot of so-called communal historians attribute to in India, I would say that you have to look for other factors. And religious factors may come in, but only temporarily. I mean, even if you look at Chris Bailey's account of 18th century communal, the proto-communal, pre-communal, it's very much in tune with what I'm saying. I would say that even the violence that took place in 1984, the Hindu-Sikh violence, has more in. So it is not the quantum of violence and the number of people killed or the temple being destroyed. The point is that it's something happening and then returning to what we might call a certain kind of, pre-violent equilibrium where, I mean, it's not happened fully in the modern conditions. It's unlikely to happen. But by and large, I think in the case of never between Hindus and Muslims in India in the last 2 centuries, it's not been the case. But in Sikh and Hindu, the violence is, the relations have never been permanently damaged. It's more like what you might say used to happen in the past in India, I would imagine. But I stand corrected. I mean, I don't know enough. I'm only trying make sense of as much as I can of the past and the present and the difference between past and the present. I do think that the differences in the ideas of religion do make an enormous difference. And I think this is, what happened in Palestine or in the area around Palestine is an exception in the world. And it's an exception that has been repudiated by a lot of people in Europe and by a lot of secular Muslims. It's not as if these are new developments. Even in Islam, this is you remember the days of Arab nationalism, and remember what happened after the rise in oil prices and the birth of Khomeini's Iran, and the taking over of the mosque in Saudi Arabia, and the deal that was struck between the Saudi royalty and the militants. I mean, I think the change that has taken place in Islam in the last 50, 60 years, it's a kind of, it's building on a resource that has been rarely used, I would say. Not as frequently used as people would like to make it. It's not as essentialized, essentializable as a lot of people would make it. I think the record, frankly, of Christianity has been in a certain, and that is why the vehement rejection of a certain kind of Christianity in Europe and the birth of European secular humanism has to be understood in that context. So I would say that Buddhism. I would look at the motives and the ideological justification, not of the actual occurrence of violence and skirmishes and destruction. I would still say that religion-based destruction of temples, of even Buddhism. I mean, historians, people are today coming up with some explanations for why Buddhism kind of disappeared, but I think the explanations which are most of the explanations, in my view, which are very convincing, are not grounded in this in the idea of this true and false, internal enemy, external enemy, and all that. We are running 6 minutes left. I'm afraid. Sorry about this, some mix-up, but it happens. But we can take 2-3 questions before I go.
Yeah. I will ask Vinod to share question. Vinod, mobile, can you please very brief question because Rajiv doesn't have any time.
Yeah, it was an excellent talk and I appreciated it. I just have one question about the uh, Indian form of secularism versus the Western form, which is the French laïcité or, complete separation. The Indian form, it seems to me, uh, and I say it in the context of the two-nation theory, in a sense, which had this rigid, exclusive separation that Savarkar talked about and Jinnah talked about. Uh, the Indian form seems to be a shared cultural space as we experienced it. I was born in Lahore. I went through, at the age of 6, through all the violence of the partition, going from Lahore to Amritsar, Firozpur, refugee camps, seeing bodies, etc. But at the same time, the existence of a shared cultural space was always there also. When even during the worst times of partition, I would see Hindu and Sikh women going to dargahs, as my mother would, to get some taweez or get some benefit, something like that. That is, these two ideas kind of dialectically were there at the same time, the exclusive and the inclusive. So I'd just like you to comment on the fact that the exclusive seems to have gained politically in India now, which did not exist when I was growing up in the 50s in Delhi and so forth. But now it seems to be gaining traction. So, what is the factor that gives rise, political, social, or otherwise, that gives rise to the primacy now of separate and exclusivist type of interpretation? Thank you.
I think, yeah, excellent question. I'm sorry, Vinodji, I won't be able to answer it as well as I would like to. But I think, look, I mean, the two-nation theory is already built on this. One is drawing upon a religious resource and mixing it with the exclusivist idea of nationalism, and the other one is transforming its religious resource into a nationalist, exclusivist nationalist resource, and you have the two-nation theory. And that's there already in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, resulting in the partition. Of course, it would be foolish to say that that's the sole cause. I mean, there are a number of factors, and an ideological or religious motive alone cannot explain. There are a lot of contingent reasons. The partition could easily have been prevented. I mean, not easily, but could have been prevented. But it didn't happen. So it would have just remained a two-nation theory and not become practice. But ideas matter. And if it wasn't for this two-nation theory, the two-nation practice would not have happened either. The but you see in the space, at no point of time, even in Pakistan and Bangladesh, the exclusivist idea is not taken over, and it's not taken over completely. That older imaginary of Asia and the subcontinent continues to persist. That's the point that I'm making. Religionization is not a finished product. We have to work much. We don't have to work as hard as the Europeans had to push back.
Yeah.
It's easy. It's still possible for us to push it back. That's where the hope lies, because our resources are much stronger. Their resources, they had to push back totally against something. We don't have to do that. So today also, it's strengthened, but it's not irretrievable, and it's not, you cannot just give up hope totally. There is a very strong pluralist imaginary in India, even today. And, even local cults are a big resistance to this hegemonic national project. They are very peculiar. I mean, even Rahim, with all his mafia and all that. But, caste, women, Dalits, women, Muslims, they're all there in Shirdi ka Sai Baba. These are, I wrote a little paper on that. These are, you have to see them not through one lens. You have to see them through multiple lenses. And the daily lives of people, popular religiosities, again. So I think there is, I wouldn't lose hope completely, although there is much to bemoan and lament and be very unhappy about today. But I don't think, I think there will be a comeback. We may not live to see that day, but there will be a comeback.
Inshallah.
I really I'm sitting here and my hosts are asking me, because I have to go to a hall from here.
Yeah, but
I came in early because I can have a separate session for question answers.
Yeah.
I can also I was clicking at the questions on the chat so that I can have them here. But if there are other questions, please, Ravi, आप ले लीजिएगा, मुझे भेज दीजिएगा. अगर एक छोटा सा और करना है तो वो कर लेंगे. I'm very sorry. ये गड़बड़ हो गया. आज मैं चाहता तो एक क्वेश्चन आंसर का सेशन 1 घंटा चलता.
No, it's okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Okay.
Bye.
Please send me a list of all the people who attended this.
Sure.
So that
Yeah,
we can have if there are people I can connect with, I will connect with them.
Okay.
Thank you,
Rajeev,
for coming, and we'll definitely see that you are back here again. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for being here, for participating in the discussion. I know that there may be lot many questions are there, many luminaries are here, so the discussion could have gone on for much time. But anyway, so we'll meet in the next month. Professor Sucheta Mahajan will be here in the Democracy Dialogue lecture next month, end of next month. So